Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be in Porto, which I seem to have visited a number of years. So before I start, I want to talk about the sensibility I have for architecture, and that will explain how I explain it. And so for me, architecture isn't just about architectural issues. It's about the whole background that we use as designers. And I can see, let's say that background is a series of cultural agreements that we all have, which are different in each country. And you can see it most strongly in buildings. So when I look at the buildings in Porto, I can see a very different set of agreements about what's right and what's appropriate to what I can see in London. And when I look at a location for a project in the surroundings, in the buildings that are in the surroundings and in the countryside, I can see those agreements at work. And when I work in relation to them because my aim is to produce a communicative architecture. So the big aim is, on the one hand, to make architecture which satisfies the needs of people who I don't even know, which is an extraordinarily difficult ambition. And on the other hand, it's to make architecture which makes a cultural contribution. You know, when we go to a Baroque city, we see a picture of political organization, and we see, let's say, a demonstration of ideas, and buildings, because they're everywhere, are great communicators of cultural ideas. So having said that, I'll try to show in the buildings that I'm revealing tonight how that works. So the first is an art museum in Denmark in a place called Fuglsang, which means bird song in Danish. And it's a museum which has a collection of paintings and sculpture which is very local. The collection of paintings ranges from mid-1700s to mid-1900s, and all of the work is in the different European styles, so there's Impressionism and classic painting. And this collection of paintings is very important to this area because some of the pictures show this place, Fuglsang. And so it's more than an art museum. Somehow it's a big social object. And to reach it, you drive for a very long time. It's 2.5 hours south of Copenhagen. And you drive through flat countryside. It's just very flat. And then you arrive in this space. I wonder if I can do it, yeah. You arrive here, between a barn and a house. And you find yourself in a farmyard. And that's where the building is located. And then opposite is a manor house, which has a long history of engagement with music. So the composer Carl Nielsen worked there. And so there's this rather strong and beautiful combination of a formal house and an agricultural building and a pond. And that building, the manor house, was very intriguing for me because it's country classicism. It's not high classicism, it's classicism that came a long way to be here and was built by local builders. And each of the rooms has a similar treatment, but it's slightly different. And the floors change. There's a real casualness which I wanted to capture in the building that we made. And so it was a competition, and the competition rules suggested that that the new building should be here to close the farmyard. But we didn't want to do that because the view of the land was so good when you arrived. You saw, and I'll show this in a minute, you saw flat ground that went out to the sea through a nature reserve. And I thought that when you had driven through the countryside, to finally be in a place in the center of the countryside before you saw any pictures would be a great thing to do. So we built it next to this house, and so when you arrive by foot, you see the sea in the distance. And then as you walk toward the building, this part of the building steps forward, and so you lose the view. The view's given to you, and then it's taken away. And then inside there's a cafe, and over on this side is an art studio. And through the window of the art studio, you see another part of the farm. You see a place where they grow apples. So the view is given to you and taken away. Now, this may not seem to have much to do with an art museum, but actually, an art museum needs to not just be a place of galleries that are good to look at pictures in, but actually a place that you can recognize. And it needs to be a place in a particular way. It needs to be a weak space. It needs to be a space which, when it has no art in it, doesn't look very good. But when it has art in it, it looks magnificent. And so I'm interested in the spaces in this building where they have slight changes. The floor pattern changes, the ceiling pattern changes, but they're weak changes, and they occur in the periphery of your vision. They're not in the foreground, they're at the edge of your vision. So the work of the gallery is to show you the paintings, but it's also to stimulate you in the periphery of your vision. And in this central gallery that leads from the cafe, you see somebody stretching like this, which is rather charming. And they'll be stretching forever because they're in a photograph. And then you see the landscape that you first saw when you came in. And then on one side is a gallery for changing exhibitions. And I often joke that this sculptor is looking at his watch, wondering how long this lecture is going to take. So that gallery, like all the galleries, it has daylight, but that daylight can be changed to darkness. So at one end, you can have a painting that needs to be lit by electric light, and then further along you can have it lit by daylight. And at the other end of that range, it's a different set of galleries. And because the collection is permanent, we could make gallery spaces that were made for particular types of art. So if you come back into that central corridor, then you find a group of rooms on the other side, which are very small. They're 6 meters by 6 meters. And in the ceiling is a zenithal roof light. And I hope you noticed in the first photograph there were 3 figures on the roof. They are very tall roof lights. They're tall partly because I wanted them to be present, but they also mean that sunlight can't come in. Sunlight will stay up here, and then there's also a means to change it to darkness. And the effect of that is to light the floor of the gallery, but the walls are lit by spotlights because, as I'm sure you all know, you need 50 lux on here because you need to conserve the paintings. But it looks as though the room is daylit because the light subtly changes and your eye is affected by it. but it doesn't like the paintings. It looks as though the paintings are lit by daylight, but they're not. And then you might notice that the rooms on this side are linked together in, as they say in French, enfilade. And this, I have to say, was part of a series of really great briefings from the client. And the client worked for a year on the program for this building, and they hired a local architect to design for them to see what their program would look like. And the local architect knew that they would not get the job. So the work was really beautifully done. And one of the aims of that client group was this, that if you have a group of children being shown around the big galleries, and you were a single person like this who wanted just to quietly look at a painting, you could escape. There were numbers of routes through the building that you could escape. The other thing to say is that in the big galleries above that ceiling, there's huge amounts of acoustic absorbent, so that usually in an art gallery it's too noisy. In these spaces they're uncannily quiet, so they're much more peaceful. And at the end of that enfilade is a room for plaster cast sculpture, which, because they're not sensitive to light, can have a window. And when you come from that room, you come back into the central space, and you find this room at the end, which was another idea by the clients, has no art in it. It's a place where you look at the landscape again. Now, this is not a big museum, but there is something deadening about being in zenithally lit spaces looking at artworks. And here's a moment where you come back from looking at the art and you see where you are. And in a way, what I hope this room does is it says that these fields that you can see are an artifact. They were made over hundreds of years by farmers. They dug up the trees, they planted the crops, they flattened the land. And so at this point, my maybe fantasy is that you can see that this land is just as creatively made as the paintings in the gallery. So it's a statement of solidarity with the anonymous people that make the world what it is. And these photographs show that the building, in a way, has lots of different facades. So, for example, when you get to this part, when you walk around it, it becomes very, very abstract. And what I want to say about that is that we think that abstract architecture was created by the modern movement, but actually it wasn't. It was always in vernacular architecture, where a building type was made, and then it was modified, and it was simplified, and it was simplified, and it was simplified. And I think I learned this looking at Caesar's Bank in Villa do Conde, where it looks like a building of modernism, but if I look at the buildings around it, which are narrow and long, Caesar understood this in the most magnificent way. And it sits in a field, so it has lots of different presences. And at certain points, this part that projects for the room to look at the landscape talks to this building. So I try always, when I work, to have a dialogue with the buildings around the project that I'm making. And that's quite strong in the Red House in London, which was made, well, 20 years ago now, but this street was made probably in the late 19th century. And it was made rather carelessly, in the way that lots of London is made rather carelessly. But it was a sort of bohemian suburb. Oscar Wilde lived in this street, And the building next door was the studio of the American impressionist Whistler. And there's a long story to this about Whistler's house being designed, and then it was bought, Whistler's house was bought by an aristocrat. We do have aristocrats still in the UK, unfortunately, and the aristocrat decided that they would make a new house, and it would be a classical house without any ornament whatsoever, and it was awful. And then a developer bought it some years later and found that without permission he could put these very weak classical facades on it. So we have a building which is a real cultural artifact. It's architecturally terribly weak and culturally fantastically strong. And when we were designing the Listen Gallery, it was rumoured that Margaret Thatcher was going to buy this house, so it became even more charged. So it seemed to me exciting to make a new building that was paired with this ugly sister. And there's a strategy in this building which I often use, which are very, very simple urbanistic moves. So this part of the facade lines with this, and that lines with that, and the parapets line through. I mean, it's stupidly simple, but it lets me have a facade that has much more three-dimensionality than the rest of the buildings in the street. And so it's like this, and that's where you enter. This is a garage, which is, when it opens, there's an ornamented ceiling. And then this is a staff apartment. And I was fascinated by lots of things, but I was particularly fascinated by Victorian architecture of the type you find in this street, with asymmetries, with a large room here and two smaller rooms above it, and the energy of that kind of facade. So when you come in through here, you find a classical staircase. Now, this was quite controversial when I did it, and people asked whether it was a postmodern building, but it's not. It's a building which is a modernist building, and I'll back that statement up. If we think of modernism beyond architecture, if we think of music and painting and literature of modernism, James Joyce would use the Ulysses myth as a structure for the book of the same name, and then he would add to that ordinary speech. Stravinsky wrote The Rite of Spring, where he used traditional Russian folk motifs in combination with Debussy's way of making music. And Picasso would repaint Velázquez as a cubist painting. So it doesn't seem strange for me as an architect of modernism to use anything I like and put it in the building if it seems relevant to the time we're in. So here we have a Palladian staircase in a room that leads into a back room to a garden. So as you come into the house, there's a small courtyard, and the city goes away, and you're quiet, and you come into this classical staircase, and then suddenly you see the back garden. So the transition from the city is very quick and very poignant. You know, somehow you understand and get pleasure from the fact you're living in an energetic city, in a peaceful place. And further along here, you can see it, is a dining room that projects into the garden. And these windows can open, so it can be a pavilion or it can just be a room. And then on the floor above, this is a view looking out to the garden. And there's a balcony here. I'll explain how this works in the very next slide. So that balcony is this. that's the projecting dining room, and that balcony is on the first floor, which has, well, it has a staircase that brings you down from that big room into the garden, so it has this sort of intimacy. But the big room above it is like this. It's 6 meters wide, 13 meters long, and just under 6 meters high. And it's for the collection of paintings of the owner. So the ceiling conceals the lighting for those paintings. And of course, it's a classical room. Of course, it's a Italian palazzo. Of course, it's a Dutch canal house. But it doesn't bring it to the conclusion of those examples. It stays permanently open and to interpretation. So on the one hand, it has familiarity. On the other hand, it has openness. And on the front of that room is the bay window that you would have seen in the earlier slides. And of course, it's a gesture. It's a gesture to organize the facade, to separate the big room and the small windows. But it's also a place where he works, so the owner works. And thinking about windows, they're a kind of miraculous invention which has taken thousands of years to develop. Somebody devised a window, and then somebody altered the window, and somebody altered the window again, and then it had to have double glazing in it, and then it had to be more resistant to air permeability. So a window is not innocent. It's a hugely culturally invested object. But from my point of view, what a window does in a building of windows rather than glass is that when you stand close to the window, you're part of the neighborhood. And when you're inside the building, inside the room, you're not. So it gives you this control which is deeply culturally embedded. And then I made rather a jump. If you go to the top floor, there's a bathroom and a bedroom. The top floor is a series of bedrooms. For some reason, I never show plans, which is rather bad of me. But anyway, this is the bathroom, and it's arranged around a courtyard. So the bathroom and the bedrooms, the idea of this courtyard is that the plants take away the architecture. There isn't any architecture. That when you are in this space or looking into it, there isn't any architecture to take you away from the dreams you might have when you're sleeping or bathing. So it's about being in this space without the architecture getting in your way. And from that courtyard, you see London. And this is very, very London, a series of crazily put together buildings, some of them beautiful, some of them not. Now, miraculously, we were asked to design an embassy. Since I'm a socialist Republican, that was a kind of very strange thing. But partly we got it because the red house that I've just shown was thought to be like an ambassador's house. And we originally had a more interesting project, but then we ended up with this building. And there are a couple of things to say about embassies. First, that they're very simple. They're an office building with an espionage department on the roof. That's it. And they also have certain constraints about which departments can go underneath each other because of the risk of people listening. And when they were building this, I went to site, and there were two gentlemen on the site standing as if, like military people, with their hands behind their back and their feet apart. And I said, "What are you doing here?" And they said, "We're from the Department of and we're here to make sure that all the reinforcing that goes into the building really is reinforcing. It is not a microphone." So then they said that they had to do this because the Russians had drilled a 30-meter hole under the street to listen to the British Embassy. So it was full of things like this, witty things like this. But the other aspect of an embassy is that if, as Britain did, you think it's really a good idea to help the Americans invade Iraq, then you shouldn't be surprised if people want to blow your embassies up for the next 35 years. So the facade has to be blast resistant, and it has to have a fence in front of it that's capable of resisting a vehicle full of bombs, and these too. So how do you do that and not make a building that looks like a fortress? Because embassies traditionally are a part of the culture of a city. They have events, cultural events. They're not locked away. And the Americans have made a bad decision. They've removed all of their embassies from the center of cities, and they're putting them outside with defensive water around them and things like that. So the message is wrong. The Brits are a bit more relaxed about things like this. But you have to have security in the facade, and I'll show you in a minute how that works. A third point is that when you make an embassy, you think, well, there must be somebody in the Foreign Office who will say, now, lads, if you're designing an embassy, it should look like this. But nobody says that. And actually, all nations, all civilized nations, choose an architect who they think represents, has reputation, and lets them make a design statement as a way of talking about how the nation thinks of itself. So we thought, what could we get this embassy to say? Now, it's in Poland. It's very cold in the winter and it's very hot in the summer. And so this has, I mean, it's not magic, it has a double facade. So that in the winter, it's closed like a giant jersey sweater. And then in the summer, it's open at the top and the air is exhausted. And this faces south. It has to face south given the shape of the site. So outside, you have a very simple curtain wall facade which reflects the world, the trees and the sky. We'll go back. That's what it's doing. And then inside, you have a facade that's incredibly thick and strong. It's triple glazing, and the outer piece of the triple glazing is 4 centimeters thick, and it's the glass you use in banks. So you could fire a 9mm pistol at this building and it would go, ha! And you probably could scrape off the body of a bomber if they got that close, So it's doing its work. So you have double message. On the one hand, you have this picture of reflection of nature, and it's not an official building. And inside, you have a picture of strength. And you might notice that it has a shape, and it's to do, as I say, with what department can go above which. But it creates 2 roof gardens, and one of them, this one, is for everybody in the embassy to use, and then the other one is just for ambassadors. So people like Kim Jong-un or Donald Trump and those kind of champions of peace can be taken to the garden and thrown off the roof. And then, of course, you need a formal entrance because ambassadors and the Queen arrive, so they arrive underneath this stone entrance. And inside, well, you need something on the glass to stop ambassadors walking into it, and so it's the British coat of arms. And we didn't realize this, but when the doors open, England goes in one direction and Scotland goes in the other direction. And inside is an entrance hall with a room which, beyond that door, which is for public events. And then this is the work floor. The facade that I showed at first is here, so it's very, very quiet. And then inside there are these internal gardens with glass roofs. And that's because in Poland, the legislation on daylight's very strict. It gets dark, so they want you to provide only a maximum of sort of 10 meters from daylight. And then if you approach the building by car, you go through a sort of Porto where the car is searched, and only ambassadors and high-level people can drive in, and there's a garage there which opens and closes like that. But the people that I was interested in were those people who were coming here for a visa, and getting a visa in an embassy is the most miserable procedure. Suddenly you're a sort of supplicant, and I've spent too much time in Grosvenor Square with my passport in a supermarket bag waiting to get into the American embassy. So I thought we could do better. So if you're a consular visa applicant, you come down here, and this is glass, and you see all of the embassy, you see all the garden, you see the front, you get to enjoy it. And then at the back is an entrance to the consular visa section, which is just as dignified as the one at the front. And coming into buildings, making public buildings be welcoming is the theme. And this is a town hall in Deinze in Belgium, and near where Raamwerk has their office, they tell me. And it has two parts: the council chamber, and then the office where municipal workers work. And it's a low energy building. Heat, it has ground source heat, quite tall floors so that it's daylit, and then these loggias which shade it from the sun, which give a kind of dignity, but at the same time a certain abstract quality. And it looks, sorry, do you mind not, it's in the periphery of my vision, sorry. This, in its strange abstract way, talks to the church. These are the two buildings as you come into the town across the river, which you can see here. And so it's a building which doesn't just talk to the church, it actually talks to these buildings. This is the ordinary buildings of Deinze, which are not wonderful, but actually have they make the city. So this building talks to those as well as to the church. And on that side, it's made of the kind of materials that, I say this with some hesitation because we have Flemish colleagues here, but it seems to me these seem to be the materials that a Flemish contractor can work with, which are a stone which is fixed to concrete and then precast concrete. So it has a certain subtlety of materiality, and against it is anodized aluminium. And so that is a view of the loggia along the council room. And it means that councillors, when they make a break from their meetings, can come out onto that balcony and see the world. So they're not isolated. But the council chamber is also a place where you can get married or have a party. So people will hang out on this balcony. But it's not just here that takes place, because on this building too, there are spaces to eat outside. And so the idea here is that the loggia has a number of functions. It's a shading device. It's a device to give some dignity to the facade, but it's also a place where people can leave their office, as this person can, and go onto a balcony. Because clerical workspaces are like a prison in a way. You know, you're in them all day. And it seems to me that if you can just go outside and have a conversation or clear your mind that must make your working day better. And when we were making this building, there was a terrorist attack on a town hall in Belgium, and we said, look, we know about security because of our experience at the embassy. Should we put barriers in? They'll be very discreet. Can we restrict the public's access? And they said, no, this is a public building, and they have to be able to go everywhere. And this isn't a posed shot. The photographer saw these children, and so it's a very generous attitude behind this. But that's the council chamber, and it means that the politicians can be seen by the people they represent, and the people they represent can see them. And that's quite a big motif in European municipal level politics. Another project in Belgium, in Antwerp, are these two towers, which it's part of a group of 6 towers. There are 2 by David Chipperfield, 2 by Roger Diener, and for some reason I haven't got photographs of their towers. You know, it's going to happen. And these 6 buildings were part of a development by a very sophisticated Antwerp architect. And in the middle, he had to sell the project, and he sold it to a much more financially minded developer. And he suggested that the developer work with us, so it was a great gift. And 2 things happened. The developer had a scheme made for these 2 towers in order to price their bid, you see. But the scheme that they had made was awful, a terrible scheme, and we thought, how can we deal with this? So we have a colleague in the office that makes renderings, and I said, render this in the worst brickwork you can find. And we took it to them, and we said, what do you think? And they went, ugh. So then the design started, and they said, what material do you want to build your building from? And I said, well, concrete, like David Chipperfield. And they said, well, you can't, because the budget won't allow it. So we said, what should we build it from? And they said, brick. And we thought, what are we going to do with brick? So we did do something with brick. We made, the idea here was to make a very simple communicative form. And fundamentally, they're the same building, although they're a slightly different shape. And this one's got a horizontal emphasis, and this one's got a vertical emphasis. And this one has open corners, which is important to the imagery. And the point, well, it has a crown which is lit up, so it's quite vulgar in a way. But its animation comes from the fact that depending on who's in the house, you get a different light pattern. But in the corners, this is important. If you're going to do something simple, it's never that simple to do something simple. So usually you'd put a light in the ceiling, but all the lighting comes from below so that you see the ceiling lit, you know, and it's part of what the animation of this facade. So here's it in detail. This was our anti-climb strategy, and it looks rather handsome. There's landscaping by a French landscaper, and then there's, in front of all of the buildings, there's a portico. And then this is the entrance. So it's quite plain, but the dignity lies in the space and the light. And then these corner balconies. Well, given that my work is very concerned with relating to its surroundings, how can you do that in a tower, which is in a dock, which is not in the center of the city? Well, first of all, you can make the tactility of the building evident. You know, you can put your hand around and feel the structure of the building. But these things let you see the dockyard around you. They let you see this changing landscape, because this will all change. Over the next 20 years, it will become more and more residential. And that's another reason why you have a corner balcony, because why would you have a column in the middle when you can get this beautiful view? And another project in Belgium, this is the third project in Belgium, which is, it's called SIAC, but it's actually, it used to be this was a garage, and it's not listed, but it's historically important. And the developer, we kind of extended it, and we did this with a commercial architect in Ghent, to the amazement of the Flemish architects. We actually danced with the devil, which worked out very well. The devil turns out to be a very good dancer. And so what did we do? Well, this original building finished here, and then we made a series of apartment buildings which are separated by these glass screens. And when we looked at the project, we realized that if you put all the accommodation around the edge, when you got to the corner, the space between the buildings would be too small. So we said, let's put the buildings across the site, see? And that's why we won. Because this street, retail doesn't work here really, because it doesn't work. So we wanted something that would animate the street. So we said that these gardens would add value to the street, and they would mean that if you're in the apartment, you can see the surrounding neighborhood, but that you're acoustically protected from traffic, unless you buy that apartment, in which case you probably write a rude letter to us. And so you get this bit, which was original, and then these big apartment buildings. And I got fascinated with the way that cities like Paris are made. They're very ordinary. You have a facade of a good material and windows in it, and then the rest is urbanistic gestures. So that's what it looks like when you walk past it. It opens big enough to make a fire engine come in, and these spaces are places where children can play. It's a mixed community. In this part, there's what's called assisted living, so it's for older people. A beautiful program, actually. And then you get moments like this. What I have learned after a long time of making architecture is that you don't have to start in a complicated way, because architecture gets complicated as you detail it, and things like this always occur. And then there are internal courtyards which are rather dignified, and sometimes the balconies are at ground level, which has a certain animation to the space. And then at the back here is the original facade of the garage with, it doesn't have windows in it, it has window frames in it. These were curious. They were tiny concrete window frames, which we remade them. So you get a sort of rather surreal effect of this existing facade, and then this new working against it, moments like this. And then, that's a terribly interesting noise in the back of the room. And then you can see through it, and then sometimes we built apartments next to that facade. And this is an outdoor patio with an opening in the roof, and a glass floor to the building below, and then windows like this, which that shows you what I mean. So rain can pour in, and then you can open the window, and then you get this. So it has this. What I've learned to do is to exploit just about everything for everything it can say, without having to invent lots of things. You just make everything do something. And then further along, there's this facade, which is very strong. we unsuccessfully were invited to compete for Swiss radio and television, and we lost to a project that looked almost exactly like ours. It was a tiny bit more Swiss. So this is how it works. Swiss radio and television has a huge campus, and they wanted a building which was the icon of that campus. And it was a building to which the public are invited. And then it has news floors. And they wanted a building which showed the activity behind television. So you would see all these guys working away. And on the roof you would see the satellite dishes receiving and sending news, and you would see the computer storage banks. And when you came in, this is a view from the first floor, when you came in as a member of the public, you'd see a movie theatre, and then above it, you'd see the newsroom. So what was produced up here, you could see down there. So the processes of making news were evident to the public. And while from the front it looks like a big solid building, actually the middle's cut out in the back, and there's a giant courtyard here. And that gives you 3 wings, which are like lofts. And these newsrooms are constantly being reconfigured. You know, news groups change, projects change. So we made a very flexible office space. And one thing that was important to me is what the ceiling looked like. And it sounds like a minor detail, but in London, wherever you look at an office building, you see horrible lighting. That's all you see. So we were able, working with the lighting engineer, to say that if we lit the desk and lit upwards, we didn't have to have, we had tiny amounts of electric light. And there are 3 newsrooms, and they look across this courtyard to each other. So you could see your you could see your neighbours, but you had some privacy and enclosure. And that's demonstrated in this 3-dimensional drawing. These are the 3 newsrooms, and at the back here, facing the garden, was a sort of winter garden, which was where you took coffee or you worked informally. And it probably wasn't even heated, and it was just heated by the sun. So you got out of an air-conditioned space into a more natural space. Then on the floor below was the canteen for the whole of the campus. And these spaces are great when they're full of people, but when they're empty, they look terrible. So we made it so you could, it was in little bits you could close off. And over here was a cafe opposite the newsroom. And these bridges connected this building right to other buildings in the campus. So you could arrange with somebody to meet them. You'd say, let's meet in the cafe opposite the newsroom. So this would have develop its own identity. Then on the ground floor, you came in, and the news people came in. So everybody saw everybody. The news people went through a security barrier. That's the newsroom. And then there was a public restaurant here. So, and the courtyard that I showed earlier. And this plan shows the ambition of it, that as a workspace, you would have massive amounts of planting in the middle. It wouldn't be an office space with just a view of the city. You would have this intensity of life. And you would also see other life forms. Also in the cafe area, they would be planting. So you were constantly put in contact with the natural world. In Switzerland, we're just working on an apartment building in a place called Neuhausen am Rheinfall. Now, Neuhausen's kind of nowhere, really. It's unimportant, except for this waterfall, which is extraordinary. So it's a tourist location. And the developer has bought a site just off the page over here, and this is the site as it now is. And this is very typical of a Swiss city, because you get residential buildings and then an industrial building here. And so the factories start here. What do we do about that? And what do we do about the fact that there's a building here which gets south light in that direction? Well, we said that what we would do is we would work with the kind of forms that these factory buildings had. Like this. We would make a building in 3 parts, like this. It's all one building, but it's got 3 forms. It has a form here which is vertical, and it has balconies overlooking the waterfall. This side it has balconies overlooking the piazza, and then this is a kind of tiny building that doesn't know what it is. Well, in fact, it was intended to be a version of all of this that was the same scale as these buildings across the street, and it was low, so that this building still got south light across the piazza. But then, almost immediately, a scheme was given permission for a 20-story tower here. So this little house is kind of, it's an orphan, but we're still going to build it, and it's made of crêpe, stucco, and the balconies that look over the piazza will see this view, and the ones that look out over the waterfall will look like this, and it's ordinary Swiss housing. But a more extraordinary project in Amsterdam Central is this one. The backstory here is that the Dutch government decided to create a private market in housing. And the housing associations, which had huge numbers of assets, could borrow against them and make experimental projects. So the housing association that we work with said they wanted to make a building that was a flexible loft building, which would last 200 years. And we said, okay, we'll get right on it, you know. And this building was part of 3 buildings which were master planned by Jo Crepin, the Flemish architect. And each of the buildings had 2 buildings with a courtyard between it and a glass screen. And we got the best location. And I was fascinated by the buildings that I'd seen in Chicago from the early 20th century, buildings which are rather sober and which had details which after a time you could begin to understand. So, for example, this part lets there be an alignment with some lower buildings across the street. And then these balconies which face south are numerous, so that because the building was given to people to divide themselves. So we didn't know what was going to happen inside, so we made more balconies so that everybody got a balcony. And so it's a real Dutch project. You know, nobody has any curtains, and it has a dentist, a Polish dentist. It has Karel the hairdresser, who will cut your hair in his living room. It's a sort of wonderful place. And then the interiors were made by individuals. So this one is a rather good, quite conventional loft building. And this shows how these balconies work. You've got a barrier here, so you get a huge sense of access to the view. And then this is what I'm trying to say here is that these apartments are not for everybody. They're for people who really want to live in a city. This is a really urban building. And a rather more sedate building, which we made in Amsterdam North. The issue here was that Amsterdam North had never really been developed as part of what we call the canal belt. And there's a housing shortage in Amsterdam, so they're building everywhere. So there wasn't any context here. And so we decided, well, we were in a group of architects, and we decided we'd make a building which had a kind of placelessness. It might be a building you could find in Manhattan or other parts of Europe. And it's, it has a courtyard in the middle, and too many balconies. It has huge balconies. These balconies are about 2.5 meters deep with glass floors. And the apartments often have 2 balconies because it faces the river. But between the river and our building is Alvaro Caesar's building. So he gets the view. And we make balconies so you can see around Caesar's building to get a view of the river. And it's quite extraordinary because often on the river you find a cruise ship which is as tall as a building, so it's incredibly dramatic. And this is a balcony where you can look around Alvaro's building and see the sea. And well, this is a lot of housing is going to be discussed here. This is a much more simple scheme in Amsterdam West, in a very beautiful brick. And when you get an urban design from the municipality in Amsterdam, you can't make any sense of why it's there. You get a huge piece of water, and everything is turning its back on it. And you say to the planners, could we change this urban plan? And they go, oh no, do you know how long it's taken to get this plan? So we made buildings wherever they were in the master plan, you could modify the plan so you get a view or some sunlight. And that also produced a sort of randomness. You get these 4 buildings which are very repetitious, and then they have odd and strange things happening to them. So sometimes they work as a pair, sometimes they work just as a facade, with a balcony here. Sometimes that bit's omitted to make a courtyard on the roof. And then the entrance halls are special. Dutch architects are great, but they can't make entrance halls to buildings. For some reason, they're always black, and we thought we could do better than that, so we got this one right. Now this is really interesting, because this is in the north of the Netherlands, and when I spoke earlier about designing, what I meant to say was that design is a tiny part of the production of all objects. And in the tradition, copying was what you did. Somebody made a table, and somebody else made another table, and another table. And we thought, well, let's start with a Dutch canal house, which has got good brick, big windows, and a tiny bit of stone. And so we did this. We did this project with another architect, friends of ours, Juan, and typically for Holland, they have a supervisor who tells you what you can and can't do. And the supervisor was West Acht, the landscape people, and they said everything had to be mixed up. We want randomness, so we'd kind of design something and we'd establish some order, and then they'd mix it all up. So it explains why it is so random. But it's a terrace, and at the end of the terrace there are 2 rather stately buildings, and then you turn the corner, there's a shop here, and on the back, on a smaller canal, are these little houses for young couples, retired people, single people who want to work from home. And then in between the 2, it captures the view of the city. So somehow it's an imitation, and yet it wants to be part of a city. I think if you design buildings, you should want them to be where they are, and you should want them to contribute. And this is an even stranger project. This is in front of the Tower of London. which is a cafe, this cafe, which goes into the Tower Bridge. And there was originally a building here, a building from the 1960s. And when we took it down, we found some wires on Tower Bridge. And we had them tested, and they were the alarm system for the crown jewels. So we left them and covered them up. Anyway, but when you make a building like this, you think, what do you want it to be? And there are two types of buildings on the edge of the water here. One is the entrance building, which is a high-tech building, which says, I have nothing to do with the Tower of London. I'm part of the office development on the other side of the road. And then there are other buildings which are little brown wooden huts where you buy food. And those brown huts say, we're invisible. We have no architectural presence whatsoever. And being an enormous egotist, I thought, I wonder if I can make a building which composes with the Tower of London. And, well, it does, because this is wood, a natural material, and it's painted like stone. And then this is one of these upside down. And then this looks like a boat shed that might have been there. And it's interesting, when you do this kind of project, you have to deal with the historic buildings people, who are usually very good. They have tweed jackets and small glasses, and they know a lot. And I thought, you either don't tell them anything, or you tell them everything. And I thought I'd tell them everything. And I said, I'm interested in Frank Gehry, and I'm going to do a building like this. And they went, oh, jolly good. And then then after we'd finished it, they had their Christmas party there, because they liked it so much. So it was a huge success. And on this side, this is called a moat in English. There used to be water around here. So when you sit in the restaurant, you're actually looking. And from this point of view, this building is bigger than Renzo Piano's tower. I mean, it's an optical illusion, but it's a joke. Forget that. I'll move on. And it's not a restaurant just for tourists. It's actually for business people. So you can sit here and you can look at the Tower of London. But more importantly, you can look at Tower Bridge, which you never usually can. Usually you're walking underneath it or driving across it. And Tower Bridge is a classic of Victorian bad taste. You know, it's incredibly awful, but it's got Gothic towers and engineering and the Hogeshaft, you know. And so we thought, let's provide a romantic place where you can look at it. And then these are, well, they have blinds so that when it rains you can still sit outside. And but something I've noticed about the way that people design when they're looking is that you make decisions for one reason, and then they have implications in another way. And this metalwork rhymes with that metalwork in the bridge. So after a certain time of looking at your surroundings, things like this occur. You see things, but you notice things, you know, and that noticing for me is very important. A house for two artists in London. This terrace was interrupted by a rather bad building, which we then put a new facade on. And what did we do? Well, it resolves the fact that it's all the wrong shape and size. So that alignment helps that. This balcony has some of the rhythm of that window. These windows are what you would do these days. These are the windows you would do in the old days. And a drawing, finally. So that facade is here, and there's a park at the back which is at the lower level. So all of this is interesting. That's the entry level, and that's the garden. I'll show you some photographs. So this is the studio of Tim Wright, the painter of the couple. It's a married couple with children, and they both practice in the house. Joanna has the roof studio, Tim has the basement studio, and their children kind of go between them. This is Tim's studio. And then this is the kitchen at ground level. That has a window to the street, which is white glass. And then on the first floor, there's their bedroom with a bathroom between the bedroom and the street. So it's rather acoustically rather good. And then a room like this. And then Joanna's studio in the roof. She works with photographs and needs lots of light. Tim works with light and shadow and doesn't. And, so that's that project. And this is a project in the countryside in England. I wanted to produce an image of a house, so you got a garage, porch, window, and then a balcony. Because this is a small development which looks south down the slope. So the views are beautiful. So you get a sense of entry, and then the kind of array of houses. And the way that they're arranged is that there's a garden between them. I'll show you more in a minute. And this part's 2-story, and the part at the back is 1-story. Then at the end is this single-story house, and this house looks over the roof to the view. And then at the top is a freestanding house, which is much bigger. And they look across to each other. If you want neighborliness, you have to have discrete views, so you can see your neighbors. You see your neighbors at a distance where you can recognize each other, but it's not so close that you make communicative eye contact. Apparently my battery is running very low, and I'll have to stop. But they're going to plug me in. Okay, there you go. I haven't finished yet, all right? So, and then from the kitchen you look out, but there's a door here which takes you into this garden. That's the double-story part, but this is single. And so the back wall of this house is blank. So you get good south light into the garden, but you get a sideways view into the street. So you have a series of possible ways of noticing your neighbors or ignoring them. And this is the final project. It's a house for a famous artist who shall be anonymous, and called Kapoor. And he bought an apartment building in order to get a long piece of land at the ground floor level. So this is the entrance to the apartment building, and then this is the entrance to Anish's house, and that's his garage. So it has 2 very long walls, and not much, you can't get any side light in, so you have to have courtyards and gardens. So what we're doing here is sustaining a small amount of light. So that's the entrance. You can see we're using reflective surfaces to just keep the light alive. And then an electric light here. And that's the view forward. And it takes you down. This is a very confusing photograph. It's a courtyard with a Dan Graham sculpture in the middle. So I should get a better photograph. But then you come into the main room, and there's a staircase that takes you up to the first floor. We'll go there in a minute. And there's a glass floor here, which I'll explain in a minute, which is another way of bringing light in. And that's that stair. And you go down into the living room. And then on the other side, this is a view of the other side. That's an Anish Kapoor sculpture. It's not a building failure. It's not. And then you come to a garden. Along the side of the garden is a passageway with a library in it. And that takes you along here. And you go up some steps, because there's something underneath here I'll show you in a minute. So you go past the garden, and you find the parents' bedroom, which is like a little house. A little house has a stair in it which takes you down into the basement. Underneath the garden is the bathroom. This is what you have to do in London, where land prices are ridiculously high and you have to pack lots of accommodation in them. And if we go back up, and we go up this staircase, you come to the first floor, and this has a fire-resisting glass floor, which goes to an external courtyard here. And there's a family room here and children's bedrooms here. And then it only has one facade, which is this. The end. Thank you.